Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Encore episode of the Global Missions Podcast. We have recently wrapped up the 7th season of the show, and throughout these summer months, we'll be representing some episodes from previous seasons.
That's exactly right, Maddie. Our production team will get a little bit of a break before really engaging with the work to bring new episodes to life. This will all begin in September. And if you, our listening audience, would help us with this, we've got 3 quick ways that you can participate in the process with us.
First of all, and probably most importantly, we invite you to complete our 2022 listener survey, which is linked in the show notes of this episode.
Number 2 is, and you can do this at any point, leave us a message using the contact form on our website or by emailing our team at info@globalmissionspodcast.com. Your input and suggestions are welcomed.
And thirdly and finally, if you enjoy this program, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your podcasts. We do value your feedback greatly, so thank you for taking advantage of these opportunities to share with us in planning for Season 8. Well, let's get into today's Encore episode.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hello, everyone. When I was young, and I'm not so young anymore, we used to have something called missions conferences. And we don't tend to hear about missions conferences and other similar events as much anymore. Are they entirely a thing of the past? Our guest today certainly doesn't think that they should be. Doug is going to help us understand how mission events, conferences, can be a powerful tool to help mobilize your congregation. He'll also suggest a bunch of creative ideas that you might use to plan a relevant, engaging event to inform and inspire your church. Our guest today is Doug Christgau, who has served as a missions pastor at 3 different churches over the last 35 years. During that time, his churches have sent out dozens of long-term missionaries, and he has personally led over 100 short-term mission trips to 45 different countries. That's incredible, Doug.
That's what happens when you hang around long enough.
Right. Okay. Well, that is a lot of experience. Doug is also an instructor for the Perspectives course. He speaks at missions conferences and has recently launched the MedSend Church Missions Mobilization Initiative, which we'll hear about in today's conversation. Doug and his wife, Christine, have 2 children and 11 grandchildren. This is his 3rd time on the podcast. So, Doug, we say welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be invited back.
Well, really glad to visit with you again today. The last time we talked on the podcast, you were pastor of outreach at Valley Community Baptist Church, and now you're leading this new initiative. Just tell us a little bit about MedSend and how this initiative is seeking to help local churches.
Sure. MedSend is an organization whose original concern was to pay the educational loans of healthcare professionals who wanted to do long-term missions. So that is their primary ministry, and they've sent over 600 healthcare professionals to the field over the last 25 years. However, in an effort to better serve the church, and because I was available with these skills, they asked me if I would serve as what's called the global ambassador, leading this church mobilization initiative. I've been on the MedSend board for a number of years, and now I'm still on the board, but I'm a volunteer specifically in trying to assist churches.
Well, this keeps you in the same place. You said you're living in the same home, worshiping at the same church, but a new adventure for you. And now we're in this coronavirus situation now. How has that affected your work?
Well, it's affected it a lot because being an ambassador means going and talking to people and seeing people. And of course, that's not possible currently. So I'm doing, like everybody else, I'm doing everything by Zoom and email and so forth, and eagerly awaiting the day that we're released to start traveling again.
Right. Well, we will include a brochure from MedSend in the show notes so that you can learn more about this ministry and the resources they offer. We're grateful to learn today from Doug, who has rich experience from these three churches and the effective missions programs that he helped lead there. We're going to focus today on how mission events can help mobilize the church into effective participation in global missions. Doug, why do you think mission events are an important part in the life of a modern church?
Well, as I've been talking to churches about how to improve their missions ministry, their world outreach impact, many of them have said, well, we don't think too many people in the church really understand that we're concerned about this. And the fact of the matter is, if you hold an event, especially one that the whole church participates in, then you give people exposure. And certainly, some will take it with a grain of salt, but others will be inspired and will want to step up and get more involved.
So it's a way to stimulate a very broad awareness.
Absolutely.
Now, you sometimes, I've seen in my notes, the big three. What's meant by the big three, Doug?
Well, these are the three goals that we basically have for any missions event that we would present. The first one, it might not be what you'd expect, but our first goal is to build friendships between our budget missionaries and the congregation. Now, I'm assuming that most of the people listening here have a missions budget and have, at least half a dozen or 8, or maybe many more than that, missionaries. And the biggest challenge, I believe, to bringing missions passion to the church is that they would actually know one of these people and understand their heart, understand what they do, and identify with the work these missionaries are doing. And you don't achieve that typically by just saying, well, let's pray for the missionaries. We've got 50 missionaries, we've got a book, 50 pages, go through this, whenever you can. That very general approach is usually overwhelming and doesn't get you anywhere. So the first concern we have is to isolate missionaries, individual missionaries going to smaller groups of people and sharing their stories and encouraging prayer partnerships within those environments. So building friendships is the first concern.
It's number one.
The second, we want to inspire the congregation. This is primarily through worship events, large group events, but we want to get that message out to every corner of the congregation. So we bring in a skilled communicator, or sometimes the senior pastor himself will present this. But we want to communicate Great Commission truth through, generally speaking, the worship service experiences. So we want to build friendships. We want to present the Great Commission message so that it appeals to many people. And then thirdly, we always have action steps. And pray, give, and go is about as old as you can get in missions, but yet it still captures the essence of the response that we can make. And we've added a fourth because actually Perspectives began this emphasis. The fourth one would be welcoming. We want people to welcome those from other cultures who have come to U.S. and Canadian shores. So welcoming is a legitimate fourth addition. But again, any mission event should give people the opportunity and the inspiration to take another step, typically within those 4 areas.
It's very good. Inviting people not only to listen and to learn, but actually get traction on these things. And have you found that it has led to, I suppose it's going to vary broadly, but people stepping up to engage in praying and giving and going? Is it still working? Do missions events still lead to that?
Absolutely. Frankly, I suggested this topic because I know that some churches have given up on mission events, and I'm not sure why, because in my environments, my churches where I've served, again, with the support of other wonderful staff members, we consistently see more people expressing interest in prayer. In my past congregation, we had as many prayer partners. That's a person who's specifically said and written down the fact that they'll pray for a particular missionary. We've had as many commitments like that, about 1,500, as we have on an average weekend attendance. In other words, the attendance is about 1,500, and the number of people praying is about 1,500. Now, I realize, on Easter, we might get 3,000, but regardless, a significant portion of the congregation has signed up for those prayer partnerships. You mentioned earlier, we've sent a couple of dozen long-term missionaries. Well, many times the interest in long-term missions is first expressed at an event like this, because we do specifically offer typically a lunch where they hear a testimony and the story of someone who's gone into long-term missions. right out of those events, people will come up, not in great numbers, but here and there, one or two, and they'll say they think God's leading me this way. We've got 7 long-term missionaries on the field right now that have made commitments in about the last 12 years.
Now, Doug, I understand that you recommend that these mission events go forward with a theme focus. What is your thinking there?
Well, most Christians, if you said, do you know what the Great Commission is? They'd say, oh, yeah, sure, I know what that is. They may or may not, but they're not really motivated by a theme, let's say the Great Commission, which of course is the essence of why we do missions. So you need to vary the way in which you communicate that message. People respond better when they hear something that they think is new, and they respond better when they experience it in different ways. So I've always advocating specifically using a theme. It has the Great Commission as its underlying foundation, but it's a different aspect of it so that people perk up a little bit. Oh, this is different than last year. Well, it's not really different, but it's about a different aspect of the same message.
Mm-hmm. And are there particular themes that you resonate with or recommend?
Yes. One that I've come back to a number of times is basically balancing the concept of the spiritual ministry and the meeting of social needs. This is a big balancing point for a lot of people. So, for instance, we've used the theme called the Great Commission, Great Compassion. That actually was the title of a book by Paul Borthwick. We got Paul's permission to use that, and we're able to present it that way. Another time, we just called it Gospel Words, Gospel Works. So we made that phrase up, we think, ourselves. We didn't have to ask anybody's permission, but it got at the same idea that we have 2 obligations. And again, we believe, biblically speaking, the primary concern should be the spiritual needs of people, but we certainly want to recognize and embrace the fact that physical needs are present as well, that we need to meet as compassionate Christians.
Well, we were talking about themes of mission events, talked about the umbrella of the Great Commission and some themes underneath that. Some of those are kind of evergreen concepts, I call them. They're renewable year after year. It doesn't depend on the season. You also have mentioned featuring trends in missions. What are some of the trends that you would want to bring to the attention of a congregation?
Well, we have tried to be aware of sort of what's hot in missions. And right now, orality is a big deal. The fact that about 75% of the world's population would prefer not to read or is not able to read. And so what are oral means of communicating the gospel? So we had a theme last year called Saying is Believing. And the idea being that as we speak, people listen and believe. We've also featured something called the hidden half. That relates to the statistic that half of the world's population is under 25 years of age. So that has tremendous implications for how we do missions. We can't just cater to an older population. We need to be doing things to attract younger people. We need to be using younger leaders. So that was a great theme. We've done one called Concrete Faith Urban Missions. That's focused on the idea that about 50% of the world's population now lives in cities. So what are the implications there? We've had a number of these over the years where, again, we're talking about the Great Commission, but we're bringing in a new slice of information that people don't know about. I mean, the idea of 50% of the population under 25, most people they're just not aware. Then we reinforce that by having our younger missionaries present and featuring them, and the message gets across.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, some ideas there for themes. I'd like to talk with you for a few minutes about the planning process, planning that needs to take place for these events. What are some of the factors that churches need to consider now as they plan for a missions event?
Well, first and foremost, especially if you're a missions committee person, is your senior church leadership needs to know of your desire and needs to support it. One of the best ways to do this, assuming there's an openness on the part of the senior staff to missions in general, is to ask that you can set a date, good ways in advance, at least a year ahead of time, to say this weekend or this week, we'd like to focus on our World Outreach Ministry. And then the staff typically would say, okay, we can do it that week, or can you make an adjustment? but you engage the staff by talking about a specific time frame. And then there also needs to be planning relative to finances. You can't run a good event on an absolute shoestring. And the fact is, it's not an expense, it's an investment. When you put money into good speakers and good programming, that comes and bears fruit as people do the things we mentioned earlier, signing up to be prayer partners, long-term missions, short-term mission trips, those kinds of things. What I've generally told churches is that 5% of your total budget should go towards missions mobilization. And part of that mobilization would be an event.
This is really good. We want to make sure that everybody's aware of it well in advance, the support of senior staff. What I'll do maybe here, I'll just say to those who are listening, if you'd like to learn more about the planning process, we would encourage you to reach out to Doug later on in the program. And then in the show notes, we're going to include his contact information. And in the next part of our conversation, Doug's going to share some creative ideas for missions events you may want to consider for your church context. If you'd like to know more about the planning, we'll invite you to reach out to him. Just before we get to the next part of our conversation, we'd like to share with you this missions resource that we hope will be beneficial to you and your church.
For South America Mission, it's simple. Let the church be the church. For over a century, South America Mission has supported the local church in its effort to embody the kingdom of God and offer others the redemptive hope of the gospel. Join our effort through local leadership and discipleship-based ministry to help the local church flourish and demonstrate God's love and mercy to His people in South America. Visit southamericamission.org to learn more. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we are back with Doug Christgau of the MedSend Church Missions Mobilization Initiative. We've been talking about missions events. One of the follow-up questions I wanted to ask is just about duration or length, Doug. Is this something that is a day or a weekend or a week? What might that look like?
Well, certainly, I believe you should start with a weekend. I talked about the idea of building relationships with missionaries. You can't do that in a day. In fact, when I say weekend, I'm thinking Friday night, even possibly until Monday morning, if you can get the support of the church for that length of time. And that may be, again, I look at that as a starting point. Your ultimate goal wants to be something that some people would consider to be a dinosaur in missions programming, and that's a full week conference. And the reason for that is, again, that you can get so much more traction when you've got a full week dedicated to missions. And if you program it correctly, you bring in good personnel, people will enjoy it. They won't look at it as a burden. We're not talking about a lot of extra meetings. I'll clarify that as we talk about programming. But if you have a week, then these friendships can actually begin to gain some traction. And you end up with people from your congregation saying, hey, the next time so-and-so missionary is coming into town, tell me, because I want to see them again. That's when you know that you've begun to build some relationships between your congregation and the missionaries. And it's just a common sense that the longer the experience, the more likely that is to happen.
Sure. Sounds good. Well, Doug, let's help our listeners a bit here they can maybe envision some creative ideas that might work for events. Maybe you've thought of these things before, maybe you haven't, but we just hope to stir the pot a little bit, get some ideas. What are some ideas you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, you need to start with something simple. And the simplest approach is to simply take your current church programming, your regular church programming, your student ministry events, your kids' events for adults, and staff them with missionaries. Now, again, this is a planning step, and you need to 6 months to 12 months ahead of time, you contact the leaders of these events and say, hey, we're going to have missions weekend or we're going to have missions week. And can we have a missionary guest come to your meeting, come to your whatever your typical study or activity might be on a weekly cycle? So I call that saturation programming. In other words, you are saturating the church with missionary guests. And that's the simplest. And it also pretty much guarantees a crowd because there's already a group of people who are used to coming to the Tuesday morning ladies' Bible study, let's say. So they're already there. You don't have to convince them to come out to a missions event. Just have them come to their typical Bible study. And again, you need it arranged and approved, of course, with the leader of that event that they can have a missionary speaker. Just a little bit more on that. If you encounter resistance, then I would suggest just go for 15 minutes out of the hour. Let's say it's an hour Bible study. Well, can we have a missionary come in for 15 minutes and just introduce themselves and then have a little Q&A time? Well, typically when that happens, the next time you do it, they want the missionary for the whole time because they've had just a really good experience. And I always follow up with event leaders like the Bible study leader. I'll ask them afterwards, hey, how did it work out with the missionary? Typically, I'll get a very positive report. Occasionally, I get a negative report, and I do what's necessary to correct that in the future.
But just starting with what a church already has and building from there.
Right. And that I will add that includes, of course, the worship service. And again, because twice as many people are going to be in that worship service as all the other events of your church calendar combined. And typically, again, with appropriate notice, the senior pastor will support that. He may want to preach at that point, or he may be open to a special communicator. And I generally advocate for a special communicator because there are some fantastic resources out there.
Now, you talk about getting attention. What do you have in mind here?
Yeah. So when you have an event, you want people to notice that there's something different about the church that particular weekend. And so there are ways to do that. The most obvious way in this visual culture that we have is to have artwork. We spend a lot of time on creating art, and we may create very large posters that we put up. By large, I mean 10 by 15 feet. These are murals. They're not really just posters. And they would reflect the theme and reflect the missionary activity that fits under the theme. Then we will take photographs and we'll blow them up. It takes, again, a little bit of money, but you can blow up a photograph if it's got the right consistency to a 24 by 36 size. And you put those in the church foyer, or possibly you can put them in the church sanctuary right up in front. Flags, as traditional as they are, still have an attraction, and they're pretty inexpensive. You can get flags for $20, and you can get any flag in the world. And again, that just reinforces, if you've got missionaries from 5 different countries in for that week, you get those 5 flags. But that's another approach. If you want to spend a little more money, $300 to $350, you can have a very large custom-made poster. Again, by poster, I mean something like 10 by 20 feet, and you would hang that from a higher spot in the sanctuary or some part of the church building.
Good. And as far as interactive things, you've got some ideas on interactive stuff too, right?
Yes, very much so. In fact, some of these activities might sound like they don't have much to do with missions, but they have a lot to do with interaction. So we have organized groups to go to professional sports events, and we'll tell the missionary ahead of time, there's going to be 2 people from the congregation for every one of you. So you're going to sit between those guys. And if it's especially something like a baseball game, which is kind of slow moving, you've got a great chance just to talk with these guys. We always drive to the event in a van or some sort of a group transportation situation. So there's that time as well, up and back from whatever the event is. We've even organized, I don't know what you might call them in Canada, but we call them yard sales here, or garage sales. We'll gather a bunch of people. This is typically female. Certainly men could go, I suppose, but it's kind of a female event. We'll have somebody organized going from one sale to the other. We'll give all the missionaries $10 a piece and just go from one to the other. And then we'll have a lunch at the end of it. And again, what does this have to do with missions? Well, it has to do with building relationships with people. And we strain the participation to about 2 people from the congregation, or maybe 3 for every 1 missionary, so that there's enough saturation so that some friendly conversations can develop.
That's a really good idea. How about engaging with some of the kids? How to get our young people engaged? That's one of the challenges, is the new generation.
Kind of depends on the age of the kids, but we are big on mascots. In other words, we will identify, like if we have a focus on the Arab world, which we've done several times because our strategy as a church is to reach Middle Eastern Muslims. So we've got a college down the road that has a camel as their mascot, and we'll get permission to borrow that. That's an example of, so you've got a camel walking around. And so certainly the kids, it's sort of like, having Mickey at Disneyland. They're going to want to stop and pet it or have their picture taken with it. You have a handler with the mascot so that the handler maybe engages the parents who are with the child. We also have live animals, depending again on the situation, but we've used chickens, we've used goats, we've used sheep. We even had a llama once that we brought into the church. And, live animals are used in your typical Christmas pageant. So why not bring them into the missions situation? Yeah, again, as appropriate.
How about maps? We've seen some things, I was just at a missions fest, we call them in Canada. There's a series of events across Canada, and they actually had, in this case, you could color on the map or chalk it in or pen it in where you're praying for a country. But talk to me about maps. Do you still use them?
We use them, especially when a missionary is going to present in a small group. Half the people in the congregation don't realize that Angola is in Africa. So if a missionary is from Angola, and we'll put a big map of just Africa up, not the whole world, and then we'll circle Angola, whatever the place is. We did something one year. It might have been worth doing again, but we only tried it once. We had a map of the world up, and then we had push pins, and we asked people in the congregation to put a pin in a country that they had visited. And again, recognizing that, this time we've got missionary guests from these 5 countries, maybe mention those in particular, how many have been to this country or that country. Put a pin in there and kind of register your experience.
Well, let me ask this, Doug. If you've got any ideas that are kind of out there and you'd like to try, but you might not have had a chance to try them yet. Have you got any, I know, Doug, a little bit, anything wild and crazy that you'd like to give a try you haven't yet?
Yeah, well, I call these never tried that before. That's a good kind of an event to think about. Something that I know about, but I haven't done is called Missions at the Airport, MATA. And JARS, the technical arm of Wycliffe Translators, they will bring a plane and pilots to your church, and they will charge $25, for a 10-minute ride at a local airport, not a major airport, but a small airport. And then during the church meeting time, they'll go into classes and explain how missionary aviation has played a role in getting the gospel out there. So we wanted to do that, and then things got a little complicated, and we just weren't able to. But especially if your mission event occurs in warmer weather, I wouldn't recommend this for January in Manitoba.
Right.
That's one I haven't tried, but I would like to, because I think people would be excited about a new experience.
It's really good.
Okay, I'll just give you one more that I have done, but it's been so successful. We do what's called the urban bus tour, and we will have people get into a school bus. They pay $10, and we'll drive them down to the inner city, and they'll visit with some of our urban ministries, a homeless shelter, an urban mission that we support. And people have told me, I would never drive into this particular area of Hartford, which is our closest urban area. I'd never drive to this section of Hartford by myself. And that kind of surprised me. But regardless, I said, well, don't worry about it. We got a bus. You're safe. You just walk from the bus into the rescue mission, and, you'll be fine. So we get people to do something that they're just afraid to do on their own. And I say that respectfully, not condescendingly. But this urban bus tour has been a huge hit. We've had as many as 90 people, 2 busloads go at one time.
Well, it's a great idea. I'll just speak to a similar example in our city here in London, Ontario. And the reason I emphasize this is there may be ministries in your area, wherever you're listening to this, that would be glad to do this. But Urban Sanctuary, which is downtown London, welcomes groups to come and to do walks with them. when the weather is appropriate. And they actually will have a chance to, as groups of students or groups from a church, to go through the inner city and to see some of the places where the ministry reaches out to different folks in different situations there. And it makes a deep impact on people, realizing, again, and we know this to be true, but it just shows it really in a live way, that missions is close to home and far away as well. And it's not just Angola in Africa, or for example, where you mentioned it is both, and it's near and far. So Doug, these ideas are great. I know you've got lists of ideas. I'd like to turn us toward the idea of gathering the fruit from this. Once an impact has been made, you have the attention of God's people in the church. They're interested. How do you capture that attention for a meaningful traction going ahead?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you don't want to have an event and go to all this planning and expense and then end up with just, we had a good time. What you really want is names. This is really, in a sort of crass way, you can say this is one big sales pitch. And you want to find out who is willing to take another step. So we always will have people signing up to be prayer partners. And then we follow up with those people. We tell the missionary that they've signed up to pray for. We create a card. We make sure that the individual in the congregation receives that. The same is true of our long-term missions. We'll have an event, have somebody share a testimony of how they got into long-term missions. And then we'll say, if you're interested in more info, then give us your name. Or we'll offer a resource. We've got some books and items that will sustain a person's interest. And so we'll encourage them to purchase one of those. Basically, we get names. Even that urban bus tour, we got everybody's name. And then when it's time to find more volunteers to help out at the homeless shelter, that's where we go first.
As always, our episodes are just introductory and we touch the tops of the mountains, so to speak. Doug, I know that you have many, many resources to recommend, but I wonder what you would, in this case, recommend to our listeners related to this idea of creating effective missions events.
Well, my first suggestion is subscribe to Mission Frontiers. That's a magazine that you can get, comes out 6 times a year, but they are always talking about these trends and these phases of missions. And a lot of our ideas have come right from Mission Frontiers. I also know that Wycliffe Bible Translators is one of the more innovative thinkers when it comes to stimulating missions. So they have different kinds of demonstrations that they'll put on that help bring the work of translation into a more understandable light. There are 2 groups, Partners International. They work mainly with nationals, Christian leaders from other countries, and also World Relief, who also focus on Christian leadership from other countries. They occasionally will bring people to North America and are willing to share that resource. There will be an honorarium involved there and possibly consideration of support, although that's not necessarily a prerequisite. We brought in a guy from Partners International who was from Jordan, one of the most dynamic speakers that we've ever had. And we did end up supporting them, and we are thrilled. We've been in that relationship now for about 10 years. It came from asking partners, hey, who do you have out there that might help us resource our missions event?
Super. Boy, just rich with ideas here, Doug. Let me ask again, although you've been on the program before, if any of our listeners would like to reach out to you and follow up with you, how could they do that?
The best way is to use my email address, doug@medsend.org. You'll get that in the program notes. I'm glad to interact because really I believe this is my ministry now that I've out of being in a specific local church, although I still volunteer there. I would love it. They don't have to be MedSend related churches necessarily. I just want to be of help to churches who want to take the mobilization step further than they've been doing in the past.
Really good. Well, just as we finish up, last question for you. If you could stand before a group of pastors and missions committee people, the influencers in local churches, and you just had a chance to address them as far as missions events goes, what would you want to say to them?
I would say put aside the idea that they're old and tired and boring and think along the lines that we've talked about in the last half hour of using animals and costumes and posters that are 20 feet high. Think innovatively you'll draw a crowd. You'll draw interest. It'll be something that your congregation is excited about, not just, oh, here it goes, another boring missions event. Use your head, use some of these ideas, and you'll come up with some of your own. I mean, none of these were in one book at one time. They all just came out of years of thinking and praying and getting feedback. You'll see that kind of momentum within your own congregation.
It's a good word. Doug Christgau, thank you so much again for being with us. Appreciate the friendship that grows up between us, and just thankful that the Lord still has you involved, the transition here. May the Lord bless you with MedSend, and we'll look forward to talking to you again sometime. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Max.
Well, our thanks again to Doug for joining us again today. He always has very solid content. You could look back, if you appreciated this episode, to episodes 21 and 91, where we had Doug on previously. I hope that today's episode helped spark some ideas about the kind of events that could be helpful to your church. And if you're on a missions committee, we would love you to give some of them a try. Let us know how it goes. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the team, thanks for listening, and join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.